talk about promises. Have you ever made a promise to somebody and maybe you kept that promise? Or maybe you said you were going to do something and you didn't end up doing it. We're going to talk about God as the perfect promise keeper. And we're going to read in Numbers 23:19. And in this verse, it says a statement about God and then it asks us a question. So it says, God is not a man that he should lie, or a son of man that he should change his mind. Has he said and he will not do it, or has he spoken and he will not fulfill it? So it tells us in the first part of that verse that God is not a man that he should lie, or God does not change his mind. And then in the end of that verse, it asks a question. Does God say something and not do it, or does he say that he's going to do something for his people and it not come to pass the way God said it? Well, if we're going to answer that question, we would say, no way. Of course, when God says something, he does it. When he makes a promise to his people, he keeps his word. So since we're going to do a science experiment today about God being the perfect promise keeper, we're going to approach this question in the Bible the way you would when you were doing a science experiment. We're going to look at the facts. We're going to look at the proof to see if God really is a perfect promise keeper. Well, where would we look to find the proof or the facts about God? We would look in his word. So I brought some things with me today to help us do that. I have some milk here in our dish and some food coloring and some Dawn dish soap. So we're going to see how all of this together with the facts from God's word is going to prove that God is a perfect promise keeper. So let's look at some of the promises God has made to his people. Think about Noah. Even though God was going to destroy the whole world, he promised Noah and his family they would be safe inside the ark and that he would start over his people through Noah's family. We can think about Abraham. God promised Abraham that he would make him the father of many nations and that through his son Isaac, he would bless the whole world. God promised Hannah that she would have a son. After wanting one for so long, Hannah had a son named Samuel. We can think about Gideon. Gideon was terrified, but God spoke to him and promised that God would fight the battle with him and that Gideon would be victorious with just a few soldiers against a huge army. We can think of God's promise to the Israelite people when they were in Egypt and God was sending the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn son. God promised his people that if they put the blood on their doorpost, that the angel of death would pass right over and they would be safe. And then he promised Joshua that he would lead his people safely into the promised land, the land that God had told them so long ago that would be theirs, that God was going to lead them safely in, and that he would drive out all the enemies out of the land so that that land could be theirs. One of the most important promises that God ever made, he made way back in the book of Genesis, right after Adam and Eve sinned. God promised that he would send his son, Jesus, many years later to die on the cross for sin and defeat sin and death. And that amazing promise purchases forgiveness for God's people. So by looking at these facts, we can see that God is the perfect promise keeper. He says something and then he does it. He doesn't change his mind. He doesn't lie. He always keeps his word to his people. Now, if we look at this, it doesn't look like anything special or beautiful or amazing right now. It looks like dots of color sitting in the milk. But I want to show you what happens when I add in just a little bit of dish soap. When I add in the dish soap, you're going to see that it's going to completely change into something different. All the colors are going to mix and come together and make a design that is different than it was when everything was all separate and apart. Now, let's get sciencey for a minute. Why does this happen? I'm going to leave my Q-tip right there. Why does this happen? Well, milk is made up of fat and proteins. The dish soap wants to attach to the fat in the milk, so it runs around and tries to attach to all the fat in the milk that's in the dish. So you can see this because of all the food coloring. So that's the reason that you see all the colors mixing together to make something beautiful. Now, what does this have to do with God being a perfect promise keeper? Well, there's nothing special about Abraham or Gideon or Hannah or the Israelite people or Noah, except that they walked with God. They attached themselves to God and his character. They loved him and followed him, and they were friends with God. They believed his promises. They had faith and trust that what God said would happen. And because of this, they got to see the way God worked out his promises in their lives and the lives of God's people. The Bible is full of God keeping his promises to his people. Later in the book of Romans, Paul writes about this in Romans 8:28. He says, "And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his people," his purpose. That verse tells us that God is working for the good of his people, and he does that by keeping his word. The Bible is full of the evidence that God keeps his promises to his people, and because God never changes, God will keep his promises to us. He is the perfect promise keeper. So our Neeza Club memory verse for this week is Romans 8:28, that God works for the good of his people, those who are called according to his purpose. So see if you can memorize that verse. And if you want to try this science experiment at home, I'll have the directions listed under this video. So I hope you had fun, and always remember that God is the perfect promise keeper.